Welcome back. I hope you are enjoying the concert. I believe it is Valimar Johnson, and it is Bourbon and Grits. How perfect is that? And if you've never had grits, we may have to do another video strictly on grits because that is my favorite food group, and it goes so well with bourbon. So what I want to talk to you about right now is a little bit about the flavors and where they come from, but we're going to start some with water. And what water's so important, and particularly in Kentucky, because we are on a limestone shelf. Now, what a limestone shelf means is that our water is naturally purified by the limestone. Limestone removes iron from the water. So our water has no smell, and our water just tastes clean. It doesn't have any residual taste. And that's really important, not only to have just a good glass of water, but when you're baking, and particularly when you're making bourbon, because we don't want anything else influencing the taste of our bourbon. So that water is just pure. And that's one of the main reasons that our bourbon is better here in Kentucky, is because of the limestone. But it's also because of corn. When we were settled, however many years ago, the settlers who came here from Ireland and Scotland and England, but they also came from the northern states, from New York and from Pennsylvania. When they came here, they had been used to making whiskey out of rye because they were in northern climates. And rye was what was handy. That's what grew very well in northern climates. Rye does not grow well here in Kentucky. We are corn. And the settlers came here and discovered a lot of corn. So it was great to feed cattle. And then they had all the extra corn. And what were we going to do with it? Well, we made corn whiskey. And it went so well with the water. Do you think so? Okay. Jack, my assistant here, also believes that the water is very good in Kentucky. So we have the water, we have the corn. The other thing that makes Kentucky so perfect for bourbon is our temperature. We actually have 4 seasons. Some are shorter than others, but we do have 4 seasons. We tend to have hot summers that tend to be a little bit wet. We have very dry, cold winters. And what that does is it takes the wood that is in the barrel and then it expands and contracts the wood staves. So all the bourbon that is in the barrel goes into the wood and then it comes back into the center of the barrel. And that's important because the flavor of the bourbon comes from the wood. When the wood is charred, remember I mentioned earlier about an unused white oak charred barrel. When it is charred, it forms vanillin or vanilla. So you get wood sugars. And those sugars mix with the ingredients of the bourbon and the heat, and then there you go. It goes in and it goes out. And so all that wonderful flavor is coming out of the barrel and going into the bourbon. And the grain, what we call the mash bill, is really important. I think I talked a little bit about this in the first session, but with the 51% corn, the corn tends to be sweet. If there is The corn tends to be sweet. We also have malted barley, and malted barley is used to produce enzymes, which is what's important in the distilling process and the fermentation, because it all works together. I do not have a chemistry degree. It all works together to form the alcohol and then make the spirit. So you have the malted barley, and that tends to be a little bit on the sweet side as well. It also kind of gives you an oaty, a grain taste. Think about, do you ever have barley soup? Think of that grain flavor that's in barley soup. That's what barley brings to this. The only other thing, aside from the corn and the barley, is going to be a flavoring grain. And that's either going to be wheat or it's going to be rye. If it is wheat, you're going to have a sweeter bourbon. If it is rye, you're going to have a more peppery bourbon. Now, you may be saying, but Margaret, what about rye whiskey? Isn't a rye whiskey a bourbon? And I would have to say, no, I love rye. As a matter of fact, there's a bottle here on our cart, I think right down there. If it's a rye whiskey, it's over 51% rye. And that is no longer a bourbon because a bourbon has to be 51% corn. There are bourbons that have high rye, again, bullet, but a rye whiskey is not a bourbon. So, yet more examples for you to think on. Now, water. Let's go back to the limestone water and the magic of water. We talked about the Kentucky hug earlier, that when you swallow and sometimes you get that burn. Water is amazing with bourbon, not only because of out of the living waters, as the theme of the conference is, we get this wonderful bourbon. But if you are having trouble with that burn and it's just a little bit too intense, you can add a little bit of water. And you don't need to add a lot. Some people use ice cubes, and that is great as well. But what I'd encourage you to do right now is to take your bourbon, add just a little bit of water, and taste it and see if you don't see that it is smoothed out. You're going to have less alcohol, and you're also going to have a little bit of the fruit and the sweet notes are going to be more intense. And that's what water does for bourbon. It's a magic. It's magic. It's still smooth. And what I get here is the caramel absolutely just jumps right out of the glass. But the peppery is still there, but not as much. It still has that bite, but it's much smoother. So that's what makes water so wonderful with bourbon. Ice cubes, you've seen the round cubes, you've seen the square cubes. Suddenly everybody's all about designer ice cubes. There really is a theory to that. And one of the theories is that they don't melt as fast. So for people who really love bourbon and you have one of those big round ice cubes, it's going to melt at just the right amount of time that you don't get too much water in your bourbon. But quite frankly, put a couple cubes in there, however you want to drink it, just enjoy it. So that is part 2 of our lesson. When you come back, we're going to add we saved the best for last, and we're going to add food. So cheers.